Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I work within our Standards, Regulatory and Thought Leadership part of the organisation. My role is to look at the whole effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. With over 130,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle and right across different asset types from land, residential, commercial, alternative and infrastructure, it's clearly a very broad sector, and data and technology has a huge effect upon us. And I'm really glad today to have another conversation with Kerrie Machin from Mitigo. So please do join me, Kerrie.
Hi, Andrew.
Thanks. Well, as our viewers will understand, you're a very useful and powerful aid in the area of security, given how much our industry is digitizing and how many threats unfortunately are out there at the moment. So I'm looking forward to discussing that today. But before we perhaps get into the bits and bytes, it'd be great to have a bit of a backstory on yourself, Kerrie, and indeed Mitigo, before we actually start look at some of the issues that are facing our firms at the moment.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So I'm one of the partners at Mitigo. I've been working with SMEs throughout the UK on compliance-led services, not just cyber, but for the best part of 20 years now. But from Mitigo's point of view, we are effectively, I think cybersecurity means something different to different people. Lots of people think of IT when they think cybersecurity. Actually, we're a risk management firm, really, that specialise in cybersecurity. And what does that mean? Not everything that you need to consider is IT related. You have to consider quite a few other areas, certainly from a behavioural point of view and a business operation point of view. And so, we're a completely different discipline to, that your members will have IT provision. They will have various forms of software in place, such as antiviruses and email filters and things like that. But actually, it's a far broader subject, and you need to understand the risk, which is what we do as a business, and help our clients understand that risk. And then of course you can put the correct controls in place, and that's the expertise that we have here, and that we can offer across to our RICS members.
Indeed, and as you probably know, the majority of our members are working in those SMEs and smaller firms. Not everybody has the depth of expertise internally that some of the large firms have. Now, I know today we wanted to kind of focus to a large extent on four kind of current and real, cybersecurity topics at the moment. What from a high level are those four topics that you think are really kind of coming to the fore at the moment?
I think ransomware is something that's always on. People hear about a lot in the news. Email account takeover is rife. Remote working, of course, we've all had to work remotely for the last couple of years, but of course we're now getting out and about a bit more. So we're still remote working. We could be on trains and in hotels and the like. And I think something that's really interesting is cloud working. Is it safe? Is it safer to work from the cloud? Is it not? And I've got we have some opinions around that and some guidance and advice. So those are the things that I think we should be considering at the very least when it comes to cybersecurity. We should also understand the consequences of those forms of attacks. What would it mean to a business if those things were to, or certainly if ransomware and email account takeover happen to businesses? And I think once again, if you can understand that risk, then you can understand what types of controls that you might want to put in place. And as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, it's not always about configuring IT. It is certainly partly to do with that, but one thing to consider is you can't control everything with IT. Certainly you're sometimes going to need policy, for example, so that you can tell people what you're doing is dangerous if we understand that as a risk. And then at least if you communicate that to people, you can start to put the right controls in place.
And I suppose if I was to ask you what other things people need to consider, I suppose you'd talk about things like training. I mean, what other things apart from training and that issue you talked about there would you consider above and beyond that instinct to think about bits of software, which is, I suppose, the people's knee-jerk reaction to think, well, I'll buy a bit of software and it'll sort it.
Certainly, I think so. Training is Well, it's a legal requirement, really. If you look at what regulators under UK GDPR would say, something like the ICO, you know, uh, they require businesses to train their staff so that they can understand the risks that will be coming their way, because we're faced with it every day. You know, all of us, I would imagine, at some point in our working day, week, or month, will receive an email that doesn't look quite right. Yeah, and if you don't train your staff, you can't possibly begin to believe that they will understand what to do. And if they don't, they're going to do the wrong thing. And we're all busy from time to time, so we're going to make mistakes. We're human beings at the end of the day. But there are lots of other things, and I'll bring some of those to light as we go through some of the other parts of the conversation. Um, you know, but certainly, you know, the other area that I think businesses need to consider is governance. You're going to put controls in place, but how do you know they're working? How do you prove that? You know, not only to yourself, but maybe to your clients, maybe to regulators as well. And that's something that is a consideration. But again, you know, the topic is vast and wide,
Yes, indeed.
and certainly there's a few things we want to concentrate on today.
Well, if we look at one of the first of those four themes, that theme of email account takeover, I suppose almost before I ask you what are the biggest issues, it might be worth just defining what we mean by email account takeover and explaining it a bit, Kerrie.
Yeah, sure. So email account takeover, first of all, is really common. It's one of the most common types of attack. It often manifests itself from a phishing or spoofing email. So a dodgy email, either from somebody you know, or perhaps somebody that's pretending to be someone you know. That's the difference between phishing and spoofing generally,
Yeah.
is whether they're genuinely from somebody. But what's the point is they will, the cyber criminal will get inside your email account physically. You won't know they're there. They will look to harvest information, take over communications, perhaps with some of your clients. They're certainly going to look for what data you've got within your email system, and they will change some of the rules within your email account. We've seen one recently, just recently, where literally the cyber criminal has got into one account and then been able to then control 5 other accounts by increasing the permissions, by changing the settings within those email systems. And what they're looking to do is get people to pay them money fraudulently by tricking them, because obviously they're going to use an email account, your email account, to send an email to a client. Your client expects to hear from you, and at some point they'll target some form of invoice with changed bank details. And unfortunately, it's a bit of a numbers game, you know, because there are millions of these going around every day, and someone will fall for it. And as I say, it's pretty easy prey if you haven't set your email account up properly. There's certainly some things that we recommend that businesses would do as a minimum. There's an awful lot you can do, but I think, you know, when you consider what's the cost of it, yes, it can cost money because people will pay fraudulently to criminals, but also it does damage business reputation somewhat if that happens.
I mean, is this one of the areas where, I know this is not a full answer, but is this one of the areas where sometimes people also need to go back to sort of quite old-fashioned techniques of ringing somebody up and kind of validating things if they're a bit suspicious, and using other parallel forms of communication rather than being almost overly reliant on the email?
I think that's right. If something doesn't look right, you need to stop for a second, question it, and verify it. That's certainly a message that we try to get across to businesses, and that verification should be generally to a known phone number of that person if you've got it, and speak to them. If it doesn't look right, then it probably isn't, would be the golden rule. But I think there's quite a lot that firms need to consider here, and perhaps it might be worth me just sharing a few ideas of what perhaps businesses should consider. I think the first is to agree, what is your email policy? Who has access to emails? How do they access emails? What devices can they access emails from? You know, some people use the Outlook app if they're using their phone. Some people will use what we call the native app, the app that comes with the phone. Is that right for your business? Is it safe enough? Should you be accessing emails from the internet? Some people use something that some people call the OWA, the Outlook web app. is that required, or Outlook Online? Because there are things that criminals use to infiltrate the systems from there, and it's certainly one of the biggest risks we see, the OWA. Once you understand, I guess, what you want your policy to be, then you're going to need to reinforce those rules. Think about authentication. Do we need multi-factor authentication? We see some businesses think it's a bit painful to use. We would sit there and say it's a bit of a must. It's probably going to control 90% of the problem. Yeah. Certainly not all of it, by the way. You've got to ensure your email filters are set up correctly. Some businesses will be using, and I'm just choosing a brand. We're independent, so we don't recommend brands, but people would have heard of things like Mimecast that can sit on top of things like 365. You know, we often see them very poorly configured. And the other thing that businesses need to consider is their actual domain. Domains will often help you control spoofing that comes through spoof emails, non-genuine emails, if you like. And the majority of businesses that we work with have not configured that correctly, and therefore they leave themselves open to that. So there's a few things you need to consider. Training is vital, Andrew. We would suggest simulated phishing attacks. The companies carry those out on their own people, because then you can prove whether your policies and your training are working. And I think you'd rather that your staff fell for a fake attack than a real one. At least you know where then to refocus your energy with regards to, is my policy right, or do my staff know what they're doing? So, you know, those are the things that we, just as a bare minimum, there's an awful lot that businesses will need to look at. You know, certainly the configuration of, if they're using 365 or Exchange, they really do need to consider whether they're set up with security in mind or functionality. And there's a big difference between the two.
Indeed. Fascinating. Well, I suppose the next topic has also been, unfortunately, sadly, in the news on and off for quite a long time in terms of ransomware. And I know it's probably going back a few months now, but there was a well-publicized case in the US. I think it was Colony, the pipeline operator that was attacked, and not only did that, you know, potentially cost money, but obviously it brought a very important piece of infrastructure down. And I suppose, interestingly enough, I think from what I read, the US authorities, because I think a lot of the ransom was paid in Bitcoin, was actually able to trace quite a lot of it, I think, because of the openness. But what do firms do to try and avert these ransomware attacks, Kerrie?
So, I mean, look, ransomware is definitely one of the most devastating types of attack. And interestingly, I think members of RICS are less likely to be a victim of what happened with the American pipeline, because that was what we would call a targeted attack. They've gone after them.
Yeah.
Whereas with SMEs, it's more of a bit of a spray and pray attack, that they will find a vulnerability. I'm going to say by chance, but they're using an awful lot of different methods to find that vulnerability. And that's why it's quite difficult to defend yourself against, because you have to understand the methods of attack in order that you can put the right controls in. And ransomware has changed actually in the last couple of years. And in fact, I guess just to put some context in it, some of the people watching and listening today will remember years ago when you had a PC and you might have got a virus on the PC, and it rendered the PC useless, and you would throw it in the bin. And the cost to yourself was that you'd go out and buy a brand new PC, but nobody was asking you for a ransom. But criminals have quickly worked out that they can monetize this. And so ransomware attacks are basically a way of holding you to ransom. It's turbine, really, isn't it? And what will they look to do? The way that everybody hears about ransomware attacks is that they encrypt your system. So you might have a network with servers and PCs and laptops all logging in, and everything gets encrypted. You wake up one morning, go to work, and nothing works, and you will receive a ransom demand. It can run into hundreds of thousands of millions of pounds, generally paid by Bitcoin, as you know, Andrew. But of course, you know, criminals aren't stupid. They've worked out that some of your members may well have backups that will help them to restore. That's something we could talk about in a moment. But criminals have taken it a step further now to get a second bite of the ransom cherry, and that's to say, well, let's say you can restore from backup, or whether you can or whether you can't. What they do nowadays is they'll actually take a copy of your client your data, your personal data, your staff's data, your business sensitive confidential data, and then they'll send you an email telling you that they've got your data and ask you for a ransom for them not to publish that on the dark web. And that one is particularly scary because it then doesn't really matter whether you're working on servers or working on cloud. Yeah, if they get hold of your data. And the interesting thing, of course, is if you decide that you want to pay the ransom, they've still got your data. They can't give it you back. They can just promise not to publish it onto the dark web, and well, they're criminals, and you know, who do you trust? But so you're going to need to take some steps and some serious steps, because if this does go wrong, you are going to find yourself answering to your clients because their data has been compromised. You're going to be answerable to your staff because potentially their data has been compromised, but also the regulators. And if we look at someone like the ICO, if you have a data breach and it's reportable, they will investigate to understand why that's happened and potentially issue fines if you've been negligent. And so, it's got lots of consequences, this one, to, not just from having to pay a ransom, but to reputation, and then also from a regulatory point of view. I guess if we think about what is it we need to consider when it comes to ransomware, I mean, crikey, there is it's a vast arena of how they can get in. So they can come in from devices, they can come in from firewalls, they can come in, from all sorts of things. So you need to check that your domains are correctly configured, that you're patching properly, that your logins are safe, that your firewall is regularly scanned. You need to consider access management. Who can access which systems and how do they access them and how are they configured? Your antivirus, we often see businesses where their antivirus, they're relying on that as kind of one of the main defenses, and it's not always configured correctly. Why not correctly? Because the risk hasn't been fully understood. So generally, antivirus should be configured by a security expert, not by IT. And there's nothing wrong with IT. IT are there to make it work. Yeah, that's their job. Our job is to keep bad guys out. But most firms get it wrong. And then one of the things I've just been talking about is backup. What is your backup policy? Would your backup survive a ransomware attack? It's a question that all businesses need to understand. And how long would it take you to get back up and running from such an attack and carry out some form of exercise, tabletop exercise, to see whether it would? Because the day that you haven't done that and you get a ransomware attack and you come to rely on that backup and it doesn't work, is the day was a sad day, unfortunately, because the average last year, depends which report you read, but I was reading one recently, the average last year was downtime of 21 days for firms, and I think that could be quite catastrophic to quite a lot of firms if you couldn't operate for 21 days. That's a working month almost, isn't it?
Indeed. I guess it's an indication in so many cases where you have to kind of, and perhaps this is a very unfortunate term to use at the moment, but war game, you have to game these things, don't you, and understand, what a scenario, how would it play out? Do our systems, are they resilient given that particular situation? Or, because you kind of do have to assume that this can happen. Therefore, you have to kind of game what it would feel like and how the systems would react if something did happen like this.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Risk management is assuming that they can get in. Yes, you can put lots of defenses up and change lots of configuration and controls, but then you consider what happens if they do get in. And that's a lot of what we would look at, because yes, we can make life very, very difficult, but once they're in, you've still got to make it difficult and protect some of those crown jewels, that data that you rely on so much,
And I guess all of this has been made to some extent from the perspective of us who work from home more flexible, but this working from home that the pandemic has driven has clearly really kind of just changed the whole landscape of where the majority of employees now spend an awful lot of time. And so how's that caused people to think about managing risk and managing cyber when so many of the workforce spend either the whole of the week or part of the week working from a back bedroom, or indeed traveling and using their laptop on their lap somewhere. What are your thoughts on that incredibly hybrid kind of workspace that we now have?
They're wide and varied, Andrew. I think the first thing is, if you get this wrong, you could leave a back door wide open. And if we look at the last couple of years through the pandemic, cyber criminals have had a field day, because when we're sat in an office, and let's say we're sat behind, let's assume, a fairly safe firewall, but they're not all safe. We consider things differently if we're working from home, because we're now not behind that firewall. We're now sat on a router that's probably come free with I don't know, whoever your broadband provider is,
exactly.
giving you that for £20 a month. It's not quite as safe, and so businesses have given out some laptops. Sometimes people are using their own laptops to work from home, so they're not configured correctly. I think we've got to consider people using VPNs a lot more, and we've got to consider people using remote desktops or RDPs. And we consider that these things are safe, but very often the way that the connection, the remote connection, is configured is often not authenticated properly. It's not encrypted properly. It doesn't have what we call conditional access on it. It's not set up correctly. And so when I say they've had a field day, criminals, they've been able to get in via coming in through poorly configured devices, sat on unsecure networks, going through really unsecure VPNs and RDPs. And it's probably been the largest cause of ransomware attacks in the last 2 years. And like you say, many people will continue to work from home, but I think we have to remember that, even now, lots of your members will work remotely anyway, because they will go out and about visiting clients, going to hotels and trains and or planes or whatever. And if you are connecting back to data in some way, you need to consider that that is a safe way of working. And so, are those devices set up properly? Is the operating system up to date? Is the antivirus working correctly? Is it configured right? We've already talked about antivirus. Again, I can't put too much onus on how badly they are generally configured. Does staff know how to spot things that don't look right? Training comes into it again. Training is a theme you talked about at the top, and it's true. But there's an awful lot to consider, because it really is a gateway to disaster if remote working isn't controlled properly. And again, consider specialist cyber advice on this, because people come knocking on our door scratching their heads as to why they've been the victim of a successful cyber attack, and it's because they didn't really understand the risk that was there in the first place.
And I guess some of it comes back to some old-fashioned things of the physical security, with increasing number of devices outside the corporate office. You've got to make sure the disks are encrypted. You've got to begin to almost think of old-fashioned attempts of, do we know where the physical kit is, and is the kit itself protected if it drops into the wrong hands, as it were?
Certainly, let's make sure BitLockering's turned on things like laptops. Let's make sure that there are passwords to get into these laptops. There's all manner of things. You're quite right. When we walk away from our laptop when we're at home, are the kids playing on them? Do we give them to the kids to play on it in the evening? Particularly if we're using our own devices, because not all businesses have been in fortunate position to be able to provide a device to work from home, and they've had to use their own. What's going on that device? So yeah, again, lots of things to think about.
Indeed. And the final area you mentioned is the ubiquitous cloud, as everybody is hopefully used to calling it now. This sort of sense that so much of not only the data, but actually the systems that we all rely on are now running on perhaps not something quite as abstract as the cloud, because these are physical data centers. And I know from other conversations one has to consider, from the kind of GDPR and privacy issues, where these are physically located, because one can come into problems around data being held in jurisdictions which can trip you up. But obviously we're thinking more about the security of that data. And I suppose it also raises this bigger challenge, and I think that will affect a lot of SMEs, where you are to a large extent delegating a lot of your ecosystem, your digital systems, to outside providers, aren't you? You're now trusting a whole ecosystem of other operators to keep your data secure. It's not in the old days it'd be your box in the basement with the lights on and locked away and that was your data in your system. But so much now is happening in the cloud, both in terms of the data and the systems themselves. So how do we deal with that? How do we assess risk and manage that? Sounds like a daunting task, Kerrie.
I think you've just covered some of those points. So first of all, look, the cloud is great, right? And it's going to be it's the future. It's how we'll all end up working if we're not now. But and the amount of times people say to us, "It's okay, we work in the cloud." Well, your risk is different. You still have risk. It's just different risk, and actually, you need to understand what that risk is. And so, the way I put it to businesses is you are still responsible for going in through the front door to those data centers. So the data center, so the cloud, by the way, is just is a server that's somewhere else. It's just not on your premises, is the way I see it. Yeah. And so we need to understand how secure that data is with those. You're quite right. But we have the responsibility, or the businesses have a responsibility of accessing that data. And so you're going to need to consider, not all cloud platforms were created equally, and certainly not from a security point of view. And so, you're going to have to assess it to see, what risk is involved. Some examples. So the first thing to think about is, I'd say, right, things like credentials, usernames and passwords, okay, they are easily available on the dark web for sale in lists of millions. And therefore, if you are accessing unsecured platforms in the cloud, it's just on the internet. So if I'm a cyber criminal, what I can do, and what they do is they will buy a list of 50 million usernames and passwords, and they will just send an automated robotic program out and say, well, what does this break into? So you've got to consider whether you're only relying on usernames and passwords. Are you using multi-factor authentication? Some systems won't allow you to use multi-factor authentication. So then we've got to consider whether we will impose conditional access, which is a different form of authenticating. Some of us have to consider because the data is now not on your site. You've kind of alluded to it, but we need to understand what are the permissions, who's got access to it, who's downloading that information, what is your data loss policy, what alert systems have you got in place to tell you whether your data is being downloaded from the platforms that you are saving your data to. And if you don't have those things, the chances are, your data will go astray somewhere along the lines, and you will end up with some form of ransomware demand that says, I've got your data. And again, businesses will sit there thinking, crikey, I'm working the cloud, I thought it was safe.
Yeah.
It can be safe, the same as working on a traditional server network can be safe, but you have to understand whether it is set up correctly and configured correctly, and that's vital.
And I suppose it comes back to the old-fashioned phrase, that kind of vendor scorecard, where if you're going to use some kind of service like this, you need to presumably have a sensible, I don't know, checklists can sound a bit formulaic, but some kind of way of understanding how a cloud operator is working and what their protections are. And I guess understanding the issues of perhaps liability as well in terms of if things go wrong.
Well, generally, the liability for you accessing their system will come down to you as the business, because they will, as I say, they will often, they're responsible, if you like, for the back door, but the criminals can't come in from there. But if you've got a device which is connected to an unsecure internet connection, not behind a firewall, and that device is connected, and then the criminal is sat in that device, and you're only using usernames and passwords to go through to a cloud service via an incredibly unsecure connection, that's your responsibility to manage that. And the cloud provider will always sit there, or often sit there, and say, no, we're secure. Yes, but you're not. You're not acting in a secure way to get to it in the first place. And I think that probably is the most important thing to consider, is what are our connections like, and are they secure? And if they're not, and you don't understand that, because your cloud provider is not really there to do that for you. That's not their job, is to work out whether your usernames and passwords are any good, or whether your connection, or whether your device is clean and set up properly for antivirus. That's not their job.
I suppose it's worth almost thinking of the old-fashioned analogy of, you letting yourself into your office with your pass card and just letting somebody in behind you. It's that sort of, if you don't control the access to the front door and you wave somebody through with you who didn't have to use their pass, you've let somebody in, and the security system of the building, really, it's not their fault, is it?
That's the perfect analogy, I think. Yep, agreed.
Indeed. Well, I mean, we've covered 4 very interesting topics. I mean, what would you reflect on in conclusion about, what other things at the moment perhaps should people be thinking about in terms of cybersecurity?
So I think at the top, we talked a bit about sort of the consequences and the risks that people have got here, but this is all about understanding risk. Yes, from what the configuration of your IT looks like, you need to understand the risk that your people bring to the organization. Unfortunately, staff will do things that are not safe, and sometimes you won't realize they're not safe, and certainly using things like shared passwords for personal things, for work things, logging into multiple platforms with the same password, not having MFA on. There's all manner of things that you need to consider, and tech won't secure everything. You're going to have to consider policy as well, rules. What are your rules if tech can't protect you? And then the third part I think businesses need to really think about is governance. And what I mean by governance, probably the easiest way to bring this to life is, let's say you had a data breach and the ICO came in to investigate that breach. They're going to ask if you've carried out a cybersecurity risk assessment. That will be a question. The second question will be, from that assessment, what controls have you put in place? And the third part will be, can you prove that the things you put in place were working? And that's governance. That's checking and reassessing and proving that the controls you put in place work. And then too many businesses fail at the first hurdle, which is, did you carry out a risk assessment in the first instance? Because if you haven't carried that risk assessment out, how can you possibly think that you're controlling it properly in the first instance? And
As you say, you haven't got a risk register to manage and govern against, have you? So you can't do it.
Exactly, and that's a specialist subject. As I said at the top, IT and cybersecurity are completely different disciplines, and we understand risk. And it's people like us, if not us, but people like us, that businesses, need to think more and more about engaging, because I think people are now realizing this isn't an IT issue, this is a risk issue.
Indeed. Well, as ever, Kerrie, it's been fascinating to talk, and some hugely informative and interesting and perhaps concerning is a mild way of putting it, in terms of the challenges that we all face out there in this world which becomes so digital. But for today, thanks as ever for your insight and knowledge on the subject, and look forward to talking with you again.
Absolutely, lovely to speak with you.